In March 2025, Pierce Brosnan walked into Aston Martin's factory in Gaydon, Warwickshire. Sitting in the hangar in front of him was a silver-grey V12 Vanquish, perfectly restored, polished, gleaming under the factory lights. It was the first time in 23 years he had stood that close to one. Cameras caught the moment. He smiled. He posed. He looked for a few seconds, like a man who was a long way from home, because the last Aston Martin Vanquish Pierce Brosnan had stood beside was his own, and that one he had watched burn. Today, we go inside the hidden collection of Pierce Brosnan. 10 cars, from the £50 Ford he bought as a teenager, driving it with a broken door he had to hold up with his own hands, to the German invasion of his Bond years, to the bespoke Aston Martin that vanished from his Malibu garage one night in February. The cars that made him. The cars that defined him. And the one car the world doesn't talk about that ended this Irish kid's love affair with British engineering in a single flash of fire. Stay until the end, because number 1 is one of the most expensive automotive losses in modern celebrity history. Number 10, the 1965 Ford Anglia 105E. This is where it begins. Long before the tuxedos, long before the supercars, long before the world had even heard the name James Bond on his lips. In 1971, an 18-year-old Pierce Brosnan walked up to his stepfather and made him an offer, £50 for a 6-year-old Ford Anglia, a small, finned British family saloon, the kind of car your grandfather might have driven to church on Sundays. His stepfather agreed. There was just one problem. The driver's door didn't work. Years later, in a GQ interview, Brosnan described it like this. The driver's door was broken. You had to sort of hold it up to get in. You need to understand who this is. This is a boy who had been abandoned by his father as an infant in Drogheda, Ireland, in 1953. A boy whose mother left him with his grandparents to go work as a nurse in London when he was 4. A boy who was shipped between aunts and uncles and boarding houses until he was old enough to leave. The Anglia was his first independence, held together with one hand on a broken door, driving it anyway. It is the only car in his collection today that he keeps for purely emotional reasons. Restored, preserved, worth nothing on paper, worth more to him than any of the supercars that came later. But the next car proves that no amount of fame ever made him forget where he came from. Number 9, the 2017 Ford F-150. This one will surprise you. Pierce Brosnan owns an American pickup truck. Standard cab, plain, nothing fancy. A working man's vehicle in a celebrity's driveway in Malibu, California. Here is what nobody tells you about it. It is not a vanity car. It is not a publicity statement. It is his escape. Pierce Brosnan has spent 30 years being looked at, photographed, bowed to, asked to put on a tuxedo and become the most refined fictional spy in cinema history. He has lived under the weight of the James Bond name since 1995, a weight no actor before or after him has carried quite the same way. When he wants to get away from all of that, he throws his paddleboards in the bed of his F-150 and drives down to Zuma Beach, wearing whatever he wants. Sitting in a truck the local plumber probably drives, disappearing into the kind of anonymous American afternoon that Bond himself could never have. That is not a story about a car. That is the story of a man who became famous for being the most British thing on earth and who, 20 years later, just wants to feel like the working-class Irish kid from Navan again. The F-150 lets him. But when he isn't disappearing, the car he reaches for is unmistakably British. Number 8, the 2013 Range Rover Vogue HSE. When the new Range Rover launched in 2013, the British motoring press called it, with no apparent irony, the best car in the world. It was an ultra-luxury SUV that could cross a desert, climb a mountain, and still arrive at a London hotel looking like it had just rolled off the production line. Air suspension, a supercharged V8, a cabin trimmed in the kind of leather and walnut you would normally expect to find inside a Rolls-Royce. Pierce Brosnan bought one immediately, and here is the hidden detail about this purchase that most people don't know. The 2013 Range Rover is notorious for one specific thing. It is extraordinarily expensive to keep on the road. Air suspension fails. The infotainment breaks. The electronics drain batteries overnight. Owners with normal incomes have been ruined by them. Brosnan has owned his since launch, for over a decade. He has kept it on the road. He has refused to replace it. For a man with no shortage of cars to choose from, a man who has held the keys to V12 BMWs, V12 Aston Martins, V12 hydrogen experiments, the fact that he keeps coming back to a Range Rover is, in itself, one of the quietest love stories in modern celebrity motoring. But the next car? The next car wasn't his choice at all. Number 7, the 1996 BMW Z3 Roadster. This is the most controversial car in Pierce Brosnan's entire automotive story. In 1995, when GoldenEye went into production, The producers of James Bond made a decision that fractured the franchise's fan base. They signed a 3-film product placement deal with BMW. For the first time in Bond history, James Bond, the most British icon in cinema, would drive a German car. The hardcore Bond purists were furious. Aston Martin was the soul of Bond. Bentley was the literary Bond. Lotus was the Bond of the 70s. To put 007 behind the wheel of a German roadster, even a beautiful one, was, in many British eyes, a betrayal. Brosnan stood in the middle of it. The new Bond. The Irish actor cast to play the most British man on earth, and the corporate machine was handing him a German sports car to drive on screen. On November 13th, 1995, the day of the GoldenEye world premiere in New York, 20 Z3s were parked outside Central Park. Pierce Brosnan and Desmond Llewellyn, Q himself, personally walked the press through them. It was the most successful product launch in BMW's history. BMW had set a goal of selling 20 special edition 007 models. They sold 100 in 2 days. Production was expanded on the spot. The Z3 in GoldenEye was fully loaded with weaponry, Stinger missiles behind the headlights, all-points radar, a self-destruct system. Bond used almost none of it. The car was on screen for less than 2 minutes, but the controversy never went away. To this day, the Brosnan-era BMW deal is one of the most divisive product placement decisions in the history of cinema, and it was just the beginning. Number 6. The BMW Hydrogen 7. Now we move into the genuinely insane. In the mid-2000s, BMW built a car the world had never seen before, a luxury saloon powered not by petrol, not by electricity, but by liquid hydrogen, stored at -253 degrees Celsius inside a vacuum-insulated cryogenic tank in the boot. If you let one of these cars sit too long in an enclosed space, the hydrogen would slowly vent off into the air. If you crashed it, the consequences were unpredictable. There were only a small handful of hydrogen fueling stations on Earth where you could even refill it. The car was essentially a rolling science experiment with leather seats. BMW built exactly 100 of them. They were not sold. They were leased, gifted really. Number 5. The 1995 BMW 850Ci. After GoldenEye broke box office records in 1995, BMW sent Pierce Brosnan a thank you gift. He called it, with deliberate understatement, a little present. It was, in fact, a BMW 850Ci, the German manufacturer's flagship V12 Grand Touring Coupe. The kind of car that, in modern values, would cost well over £100,000. A little present worth more than most British family homes at the time. What happened next is the kind of story you only hear when you are James Bond. On the first day of filming Dante's Peak in Idaho in 1996, Brosnan drove the new 850Ci out for a spin. Fast. He pushed it hard. He hit approximately 120 miles per hour on an Idaho highway, and was pulled over by the Idaho State Police. A regular driver doing 120 in Idaho gets arrested, license gone, vehicle impounded, court date. Pierce Brosnan got a warning. Why? Because the officers recognized him. They asked him about the bungee jump scene at the Verzaska Dam in GoldenEye. He told them about it. They let him drive away. He told the entire story on Late Night with Conan O'Brien on February 7th, 1997. His on-screen explanation: the car was so smooth, I didn't realize how fast I was going. The truth was simpler. He didn't walk away because of the car. He walked away because he was James Bond. And in 1996, the world was the kind of place where an Irish actor in a £100,000 BMW could be doing nearly twice the American legal limit on an Idaho interstate, and the police would let him go just to hear a story about a bungee jump. The 850Ci wasn't a car. It was proof that being Bond was its own kind of currency. But not every Bond BMW was so easily forgotten. Number 4. The 1999 BMW Z8. If the Z3 launched the Brosnan Bond era, the Z8 was its highest point. In The World Is Not Enough, Bond drove a BMW Z8, a low, wide, achingly beautiful two-seater, inspired by the legendary BMW 507 of the 1950s. Under the bonnet sat a 4.9-litre V8, producing 400 horsepower, 0 to 60 in 4.7 seconds, electronically limited to 155 miles per hour, hand-built in Germany. In the film, the car is, famously, sliced clean in half by a buzzsaw helicopter. In reality, only around 5,500 Z8s were ever produced worldwide. The model has since become one of the most collectible BMWs ever made. Steve Jobs himself owned one. Brosnan has said in multiple interviews that the Z8 was his favorite car from any of his Bond films. The most beautiful, the most balanced, the most pleasurable to drive. But here is the part that hurts. He never owned one. Of all the BMWs BMW pushed onto the Bond franchise, the Z8 was the only one Brosnan genuinely wanted to keep, and it was the one that never came home with him. He drove it on screen. He fell in love with it on screen. And then, when production wrapped, he gave the keys back. If James Bond had been allowed to choose his own cars, the Z8 might have been parked in Brosnan's garage for the rest of his life. The corporate machine decided otherwise. But across a corridor in the Aston Martin factory, the real Bond car was waiting. Number 3, the 1964 Aston Martin DB5. This is the car that nearly cost Pierce Brosnan his career. The Aston Martin DB5, the original Bond car driven by Sean Connery in Goldfinger, returned to the franchise for Brosnan's first film, Silver Birch. Brand new from the studio's perspective, privately owned, on loan, and worth millions even in 1995. Brosnan drove it in GoldenEye. He drove it again in Tomorrow Never Dies. And during the GoldenEye shoot in Monte Carlo, something happened that the production crew tried very hard to keep quiet. After filming several takes of Bond driving the DB5 up to the entrance of the casino, Brosnan suddenly smelled something burning. He thought the car was on fire. It wasn't. He had failed to fully disengage the handbrake. He had been driving an irreplaceable 1964 Aston Martin DB5, one of the most important cars in cinema history, with the brake partially on. The car's actual owner was on set, watching it happen. The damage was minor, but for a few minutes, everyone connected to the production believed they had just destroyed the most valuable British car in the franchise. The DB5 survived. Brosnan was forgiven, and the lesson learned was simple. Even James Bond can damage a priceless British classic by forgetting to release a handbrake. He never made that mistake on his own Aston Martin. Number 2, the Die Another Day V12 Vanquish, the surviving sisters. Of the 7 Aston Martin V12 Vanquishes used during the production of Die Another Day in 2002, a small number survive in private hands. They have been auctioned. They have been documented. They appear at car shows. One of them sold at auction in October 2024 for around £50,000, a fraction of what a normal collector would pay for a hand-built V12 Vanquish, because these are filming cars rather than factory road cars. These are the sister cars to the Vanquish Pierce Brosnan loved most. They survived. They are still driven. They appear at events. They bear the marks of having carried James Bond himself during the most expensive Bond shoot of its era. In March 2025, Aston Martin invited Pierce Brosnan back to Gaydon to be photographed with one of them. The moment was small. The reunion was quiet. He smiled, he posed, and he went home. Those Vanquishes were never his, but seeing them reminded him of the one that was. Number 1, the 2002 Aston Martin V12 Vanquish, hand-built for Pierce Brosnan. After Die Another Day finished filming in 2002, Aston Martin offered Pierce Brosnan a Vanquish to drive home as part of his contract. Brosnan refused. Why? Because the car they had offered him wasn't the one he wanted. He had test-driven a specific Vanquish during press preparation and bonded with it so deeply that he told his agent he would not stand anywhere near the press car if Aston Martin didn't give him his. After weeks of negotiation, Aston Martin gave in. 3 months after filming ended, a custom-built V12 Vanquish arrived at his Malibu home. The car was hand-finished at the Aston Martin factory. It bore 2 solid metal plaques inside, engraved with the words, "Hand-built for Pierce Brosnan." At a time when a standard V12 Vanquish retailed for around £160,000 in the UK, the bespoke commission Brosnan received was worth considerably more. A unique, irreplaceable Aston Martin built for one man on Earth. As Brosnan would later say of it, there was no other car like it on the road. For 13 years it sat in his garage, driven on weekends, polished, kept perfect. On the night of February 11th, 2015, a fire broke out in that garage. 20 firefighters responded. They put it out in 30 minutes. By the time they did, Brosnan's bespoke Vanquish had been reduced to its frame and engine block. Investigators later determined the cause: rags, left over from electrical work earlier that day, saturated with chemicals, ignited spontaneously, spread to the car cover, took the Vanquish with them. Brosnan walked into the garage as the firefighters worked. He later described it in a Hello magazine interview. "I looked into the garage, and the car cover was engulfed in flames. In that nanosecond you think, do I try to save it? But it's a car. You take the blow and move on. Give thanks you're alive." He turned. He walked away. The total damage to the property exceeded $1 million. The car itself was irreplaceable. By morning, all that was left of it was its skeleton, the engine block, and 2 scorched metal plaques bearing the actor's name. Brosnan kept those plaques. Later that month, He posted a photograph of the wreckage to Instagram. His caption was the most quoted thing he has ever written about a car. All that remains of a very great Aston Martin. She was a beauty. However, a car is just a car. A life is a precious gift of beauty and holiness. The bespoke Vanquish that Aston Martin had broken its own rules to build for him was gone. The plaques bearing his name were all that survived, and the boy who had once held a broken Ford Anglia door shut with his bare hands had now lost the most extraordinary car ever made for him to a fire he could not stop. That is the truth about Pierce Brosnan's collection. If this stayed with you, if there is a car in your own life that meant more to you than any actor's supercar ever could, drop a comment below and tell us. We read every single one. And if you want more stories about the hidden collections behind Britain's most legendary screen stars, make sure you're subscribed. There is more coming. Until next time, every great car has a great story, and sometimes the greatest stories are the ones that end in flames.